Hello. Would you like me to start right now?
Thank you, Christine Sikowis. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. We're glad to have you here. You're on.
Okay. Thank you. Tansi, mio ponapitigisigao. Hello. Good afternoon. My name is Sikowis. And I am Plains Cree Saulteaux of the George Gordon First Nation and the founder of Great Plains Action Society, and a mother of three. And I have a master's degree in religious studies with a focus on Native American religion and culture, and a minor in American Indian Native Studies. And I would like to pass this over to my beautiful and talented cousin, Jenna Pratt, to introduce herself.
Hi, Tate. My name is Jenna Pratt. I'm a member of the George Gordon First Nation, like my cousin here. We are actually called, no, my Cree. I've grown up very colonialized. I was fortunate enough to learn some Cree in school, and let me pronounce where I'm from, Pusagana Ti Wianoak, which means we are the Touchwood Hills people. Um, and that's how we identify as we're Plains when it comes to clans and things like that. It's done a little bit differently all over Turtle Island. I like to identify where we are physically located from. And I also say that I'm from the Treaty 4 territory. And I say that because I prefer not to use the colonialized terms of Saskatchewan, Canada. It gives me more of a First Nation perspective and a First Nation lens of where I identify from. Oh, and I am the mother of two children. My beautiful daughter, we are been recently selected as ambassadors for the Jim Pattison Children's Hospital and the Saskatchewan Rough Rider Foundation. In some of their lottery stuff, because my daughter is a brain cancer survivor, and that ties in a little bit with some of the passions and what has prompted me to kind of take on some of this work. And I'll pass it over back to my cousin.
Thank you so much. So both of us are very intricately tied to residential schools, also called boarding schools here in the US. Myself, my grandmother, and my grandfather, and my aunt, and my cousin Janna have attended, well, I don't know if you want to say attended, but were put into these schools, and have faced a lot of hardship. And there's a very sad, traumatic, and very violent history surrounding these boarding schools. And we are here today to shed light on the rape, the torture, and murder of Indigenous children in Canada and the US due to boarding school or residential school policies in the US and Canada, and the silence behind the Indigenous genocide on Turtle Island, which these schools played a key role in. However, we are not here just to discuss the problem. We are also here to talk about action being taken to provide healing and support to our communities through cutting edge tech tools like Janna is going to talk about, and modern archiving practices, which she's also doing, and then on the ground efforts, which myself is involved in here in the US. So between the two of us, Janna being still in Canada and near our reservation and very involved with our reservation, and myself being in Canada, in the US, particularly I'm in Iowa. We are, kind of covering the two countries where this pandemic is, or this crisis is affecting Indigenous peoples. And this presentation is very fitting to the mission of WILPF, because, you know, as Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, we do not know peace, and we will not know peace because we are still struggling for freedom from oppression and white supremacy. And we cannot know peace if there is no effort being made by the colonial invaders to work on, you know, real truth and reparations, you know, meaning, you know, real efforts and real actions and real reparations and resources that should be given to peoples that are still suffering from the effects of these boarding schools or these residential schools. So, you know, what is happening essentially? Like, why are we here talking about this today in particular when this issue has been ongoing for a few hundred years now? It's because recently, just a few months ago, and forgive me because I have to sit here and think about how to pronounce it. The Tecumseh Sisquappum First Nation in Canada, which is in Kamloops, BC. They did a sonar search, or like a, you know, underground search, like, you know, like they sonar the ground and found 215 children between the ages of, I believe, 3 to around 11 years old, in on the residential school grounds, in unmarked graves, sometimes mass graves, depending on how the bodies were, you know, placed. And this set a spark for the rest of, you know, Indigenous peoples and nations throughout Canada to, you know, search their residential school grounds. All of these schools, you know, have been closed down at this point, but the grounds are still there, and these bodies are still there. These are children whose deaths were not documented, and if they were, they weren't provided a proper burial, and they were put into unmarked graves. They were discarded in a very immoral and tragic way. And the stories around residential school violence are horrific, and they are something that you could definitely say is a horror story. And it has been very difficult and traumatic and very emotional to be a part of this community suffering from the trauma inflicted on our peoples by the colonizers. So this is what is happening at the moment. Slowly but surely, more and more places are being searched. And I think we're up to maybe about 10 schools at this point, but there are and were 491 schools in the US and Canada together. So there is a long way to go. But it is necessary to heal. As we know, we can't whitewash a horrific part of the US and Canada's past. Boarding schools, or residential schools, or what I like to call them, internment camps. These are not really schools, but there were places where American and Canadian governments allowed Christian clergy to neglect, rape, torture, and murder Indigenous children. This clergy ranges from, you know, Catholics to Presbyterians to even Quakers, if you can believe it, and Mormons, you know, and Jesuits, across the board. But right now, the Catholic Church is receiving a lot of the attention, as they had a huge part to play in this. These places of horror left a legacy of violence behind. And, you know, for decades, Indigenous peoples have been discovering these mass unmarked graves with bodies of children who were, you know, unceremoniously thrown into this cold ground after being abducted and murdered. And so we've known about this. So this is not something new. I want to make sure that's very clear. This is something that has been happening, that Indigenous peoples know about and have been talking about within our communities, but it's something that the Canadian government and the US government have refused to take action on. The Canadian government has done some work, but I'll get to that in a bit. But in terms of actually uncovering the bodies and doing something about it, this is something that's happening only now, really in the past few months. So, the first find, if you will, that became, I guess, that was brought to the attention of settler invader media was the 215 graves that I already mentioned in Kamloops, BC. But since then, many more have been found. One of them is the Cowasis First Nation, which is only 2 hours from Janna. Janna's in my reserve, the George Gordon First Nation, and that's a Saulteaux nation. Myself being Saulteaux, it's been very hard to hear that, where they found 751 children. And so the search continues to the point where we're up to about 5,000 something at this point. The number is hard to know. If you search in the news, you will not find easily any definite number, because the searches are in flux and information is not readily available. My cousin will speak about that with the efforts that are going on our reservation. And at the moment, we go off of the announcements throughout Indian country, like I like to call the moccasin telegraph, because media, mainstream media, settler descendant media, whatever you want to call it, settler invader media, is doing a horrible job at keeping track of this. Even though, if you could imagine, if these were graves of white children, the situation would be exceedingly different, and the coverage would be 24/7. The response to something like this, if these were white children, would be, I think there would be a mass panic and or just a really, really different reaction to what's happening. So that's why we're here today, to talk about this issue, because it is on our shoulders as Indigenous peoples, to make sure that people understand how important it is, and how deeply horrific this is, and how we need to do more. And not just us, but I'm talking about the Canadian and the US government, to bring attention to this issue and resources. I've been doing this work for a while, not necessarily, day to day, but, even as far as 15 years ago, I was running the American Indian student program at the University of Iowa, and or the Student Association, and had I was fortunate enough to bring Lee Maracle to the University of Iowa to speak on her experiences as a boarding school, residential school survivor, and to talk about the graves, of course, that they knew about that were out there, because as children, they were given the task of even burying other children after they had died from neglect, from disease and or just violence and abuse, So in Canada, what's happening there is there's been something going on now for some time. Since about 2007, there's been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who directly, focused on, the Indian residential school crisis, and they put together a class action settlement, the largest in Canadian history, that provided survivors with funds and resources to heal. My grandmother, my auntie, and Jenna can speak about her own experience, but my grandmother and my auntie were two of those people that received, funding and resources for healing. And then there were many national events, 7, I believe, huge national events across the country that were hosted. And I think the government provided about 72 million in support for the Truth and Reconciliation's work. They also spent 6 years traveling to all parts of Canada and heard a testimony from like thousands, I think about 6,000 or 7,000 witnesses across the country. They did work to educate the people about what happened, about Canada's history, about former students and their families. But that wasn't enough. it really wasn't, because at the time, people were asking to have the grounds searched in these areas, and the commission refused to do so. I don't really know the reasoning behind it. My guess would be that it was hard enough for Canada to admit that they had participated and enforced such atrocities. But then to actually, provide the actual evidence of the bodies would be too much for them. So again, it was given, the work was given to Indigenous peoples to, make these discoveries and or do the work themselves. And so here we are now, again, with people being re-traumatized after going through a lot of healing and reconciliation. And now Canada again is forced to provide funding and healing resources for people to go through this added trauma of having to relive the experience, and or like myself, having to see this, see what's happening again after my relatives went through the healing, and then have this whole other aspect of it be relived. It's a very hard process. As someone like myself who has lost a child, I grieve daily, and I wail at times the thought of like how anybody could treat a young child as young as 2 or 3 years old this way. And we're not just talking about toddlers, even babies were murdered at these facilities. Unwanted pregnancies due to rape and pedophilia were murdered. And so it's difficult. And so these are things that are happening in Canada. In Canada, there's been about, I don't know, let's just 8 to 9 schools searched at this point, and about 5,000, over 5,500 approximately children, or mostly children, bodies found. But we know that number is never going to be the right number, because many children were lost in the wilderness when they were trying to escape and get home. Many bodies were incinerated, and many graves will never be found because they were, these bodies were hidden intentionally. And then let's not forget the aftermath of all of this. Many have died due to, severe trauma. Alcohol and drug addiction, all sorts of other, suicide, and just the continuation of abuse from being abused has caused the aftermath of actual violence being done to be something that you cannot count. The US, what is happening in the US? Basically nothing. The US has never really done anything to recognize what has happened in residential schools. At the federal level, though, because of what's happened recently in Canada, Deb Haaland, the Secretary of the Interior, who is also a Native American person, established recently a federal Indian boarding school initiative to provide a comprehensive review of possible burial sites for Indigenous children in the US. The first report is due next spring, but at the moment, nothing is really happening in the US. However, there are amazing organizations like the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, who I would direct you towards if you'd like to know more information about what's happening here in the US. Which was formed after a national symposium in 2011, when leaders from the US and Canada came together to discuss the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the need for such a process in the US. So there are organizations, there are nations doing this work, but federally, the US is far, far, far behind Canada in terms of what needs to be done here. Our organization, Great Plains Action Society, Like I said, we've been doing this work as well on the ground, just as grassroots people, like I already talked about Lee Markle. But on July 15th and 16th, we organized and hosted an event in Sioux City to welcome the return of 9 children from Carlisle Indian boarding school back to the Sicangu Oyate Nation, or the Rosebud Nation, as they passed through. That was 6 years in the making of talks to get these children home. We hosted a community meal and prayer for about 400 folks. We served traditional foods. We set up a teepee. We had spirit seats for the 9 children within the teepee. There were family members of the children in attendance, and we honored them and we offered them support. And then this caravan that was coming through was a very large caravan. It came through that evening. We had the meal. And this was at War Eagle Park, which is a really sacred space in Iowa, in Sioux City. In the morning, we saw that caravan off, and there was a press conference and prayer. And then the children were brought to Sicangu Oyate, where they were repatriated back into the land in a better way, in the right way, with their relatives, and the right ceremony to allow them to rest and move on in the way that we believe as Indigenous people that they should move on. Just a few weeks ago, there were 200 unmarked graves found at Stewart Indian School in Carson City, Nevada. That is an investigation that is ongoing, and we hope that there is some sort of reparations and some sort of ability for people to find closure with this find. Another example of what people are doing, the Intermountain Indian School in Brigham City, Utah, is being investigated right now, or the folks are asking for it to be investigated, as this school remains a part of a very troubling history, has a very troubling history in U.S. boarding school, the U.S. boarding school history. So, this is what's happening here in a very short overview. There's so much more I could talk about, but I want to make this as quick as possible because I'm really interested in hearing what Janna has to say. But before I move on, I want to say that all of this fits in to the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives crisis. And if you don't know what that is, it was an initiative or an acronym that actually started in Canada, and I think as far back as the 70s, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So MMIWG, because we have the highest rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the country, both in the US and in Canada. And I like to use the acronym missing and murdered Indigenous relatives because it's more it's more overarching and inclusive towards trans folks, two-spirit folks, non-binary folks, and men, because actually we have extremely high rates of missing men and boys as well. That is such a massive issue. It hasn't even been touched upon yet. And this is a part of that crisis because these children did go missing. Essentially, these children were essentially abducted from their families and brought to these schools where they died and never were returned home, and then were unceremoniously, discarded. It's part of like our high suicide rates. It's part of our sex trafficking rates. It's part of our domestic violence and abuse rates. It's part of our violence created through man camps, which are temporary workforce housing that is set up through pipelines where transient workers come into our spaces and inflict violence, sexual assault, rape, all these things. Indigenous women face the highest rates of sexual assault and rape in the country. The Department of Justice tells us that 56% of women, Indigenous women, will be sexually assaulted in their life. But if you talk to, grassroots folks, they will tell you that number is much, much higher. So in reality, a majority of Indigenous women will face sexual assault, sexual violence in their life. And this obviously plays a huge role in what happened at these boarding schools, as I've already touched upon, with the unwanted pregnancies, and so much more. So this whole entire issue really does live under the umbrella of the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, basically white supremacy. And the fact remains that settler invader society still does not see Indigenous peoples as wholly human. If they did, there would be a mass outcry happening at the moment. There would be massive media. There would be so much coverage. There would be resources like you wouldn't believe being thrown at this issue, but there is not. And that just goes to show you how little we are thought about, and the erasure that we faced. And that's why this presentation is called, I don't even know what I'd called it, but the word whitewashed is in it. And that's why I'm wearing this shirt today, which says, "The truth will not be whitewashed." And it's an orange, because the orange is the color that we are using that has been used in Canada for the residential school crisis. The story comes from one survivor who had been given an orange shirt by a relative during a visitation day, and that orange shirt was taken from her because they weren't allowed to wear bright, happy colors. And so orange shirts became a symbol for the residential school movement in Canada. And there's even an orange shirt day, if you want to look that up to find out more information. And so we are, this is the story. And but there are amazing things being done. And this is why I'm very honored to be here today with my cousin, Janna, who is working on something called the Mushroom Project, and a virtual reality concept to basically show the world what it's like to be in a residential school, or to show the residential schools that still exist. And I think I'm going to, I think I talked enough, and I would love to turn it over to my beautiful cousin to, just introduce the Mushroom Project and the virtual reality work you're doing.
Hey, thanks, Christine. I'm sitting here going like, wow. One of the biggest things I wanted to mention, as you're talking about, the effects of colonialization, what's today, August 22nd, as of August 13th, 2021, it's been exactly 500 years since Cortez beat the Aztec Empire and colonialization has fully happened. So that being said, when I get into this project, I can only speak about what I know. What I know is here in Treaty 4 area. That's what I consider myself an expert on, specifically Gordon's. One of the reasons the Mushrooms Project was inspired was because, we're looking at some of the truth and reconciliation calls to action. Now, when they did investigate more back in 2007, there was 94 calls to action that were released after the report came out. One of those reports was to, have a government registry of listed deaths and students and things like that. But I'm First Nation, and that's what we call ourselves here in Canada. We're First Nation, or we're Cree. How many people can actually say here? Now, number one, if you will just humor me just a little bit, because we're on Zoom, I want all of you guys to shut off your cameras. And that would be awesome. Perfect. So everybody's cameras shut off. Now, if you were born prior to 1990, I want you guys to turn them back on. And I want you to take a look, because every single one of you guys, had you been born First Nation would be affected by residential schools directly, indirectly, since the 1880s, or since the concept has been around, which is even longer than that on Turtle Island. We're mainly looking since the 1820s. Pretty astounding. So even those people that were not fortunate enough to turn their cameras on, because you guys are a little young, you guys would have been affected because your parent, the traditional knowledge that would have been passed down to you would have been lost at that time. And you're in the process of rediscovering it at this point and reclaiming it through reconciliation.
And Janna, it affects us so greatly that you yourself were in you attended the George Gordon Indian Residential School.
Oh yeah, I did. I went when I was in grade 2, and my sister was in grade 1, and we went together, and I attended for 3 years. Not the best years of my life. For a long time, as I was growing up, I couldn't even remember those years of my life because my brain just blocked it out. As I was going through the truth and reconciliation process, now we were able to sue Canada through the independent assessment process. There was 2 ways that you could sue Canada, which was through the independent assessment process, as well as claim through the Common Experience program. So that's how one of the reasons why Canada has information on residential school survivors. In my case, I did both processes. And through the independent assessment process, I had to remember those memories. And it was devastating. And it was the reason why I went on my journey through the Red Road. I started going to ceremonies, I started going to sweats. And it's been probably like close to 8-9 years now since I've started that process. And I feel like I'm in a really good way. One of the reasons I feel very strong is because, as I shared with you earlier, my daughter has brain cancer. We went through over 7 different brain surgeries, 6 rounds of chemo. And, residential school has become not my nightmare, because my nightmare is being in a waiting room for my daughter. That's my version of hell now. It's not getting tortured as a child in residential school in the chapel. So it's a little different now. So I'm older. I've been able to really see some of the issues, because as Christine had mentioned, she was talking about so much stuff, and for me it was so overwhelming, the situation that we're coming from these days. We're looking at missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. I call it peoples. We've got residential schools. Everything is tied in with the object of colonialization. And again, as well as how the government these days use the step of colonialization to dehumanize us, as they're stealing our land and resources away from us, right? So that being said, the Mushroom Project kind of came around in that non-trust of government, especially why should we be trusting a colonializer with our version of history? Why should we, when we're looking, going to, from a technical standpoint, we're looking at different data points, because I can't really put my family in ancestry.com like a lot of you guys can, just because of some of the names. When we're looking at history of First Nations people, you're named differently as a child than when you are as an adult. You've got your nickname, you've got your spiritual name, you've got your English name. There's just so much more data points that you have to cover in order to trace some of your lineage, in that kind of sense. So
to be clear for our audience, can we just provide them with a little overview of what the Motion Project is?
Sure. So, I actually run a history group on Facebook. It kind of got started off because my grandfather got sick, and I'm like, oh my goodness, what happens if Papa goes and there's nobody to ask for? So as I was, seeing the people that were involved with the Facebook group and the interest that was coming to be, we started talking about how we would preserve that history. And, it came down to ownership of the data. We didn't want we wanted to own that data instead of having it, owned by Google or Facebook or those types of enterprises that wouldn't be able to hold it or make sense of the data correctly as we would from an Indigenous lens. So we start talking, and building the archive was probably, for the genealogical and photo sense, was the priority prior to the release in May of the Kamloops information, where we started to shift our priority into like, hey, maybe we can start tracking some of these students, the deaths and their lives. So that came about. And also too, is just because of some of my running a history group and having, the connections, like we've got actually quite a number of influential women from Gordon's. Christine is one of them right here, but we also have the with the University of Saskatchewan, the head of the history department is Dr. Wyona Wheeler. We're all distantly related. We also have Professor Miriam McNabb. So we've got all of these women that are looking at and I've been talking with. We'll get into that soon. I'm sorry, I just saw your question. We'll get into that soon. But when we're talking about some of the stuff with the residential school, especially its impact and what we need to go through, the chief had called us together to form a committee. And Kamloops is doing GPR, which is the ground sonar penetrations for that. I'm looking at my own reserve, and unfortunately we haven't even started that process. And being one of the researchers, some of the problems that we have are three main problems that we're really facing with investigating the school is: number one, it was on 3 different locations on the reserve. So we're talking from approximately 1880 to 1996, it existed in 3 different locations, whereas other schools, that particular school only existed in 1 location. So it's easier to track when it's that, whereas we are looking at so much land to cover and GPR is quite expensive. So we need to be very focused in our research when it comes to mapping and where to specifically put it on. Now, the other thing that we need to be looking at is the data. Now, the data.
And so that's what the Mushroom project is, right? It's the data.
It's a lot of this data. So one of them,
it stands for multi-user shared history online.
Yeah, let me just share this. I'm just going to share my screen. Just 1 second here. So this is the Mushroom system. It is the multi-user shared history online project. Media, Mushroom Siwin, and basically Mushroom is, sorry for my misspelling of it, it means Mushroom knowledge in Cree. So myself and another gentleman named Christopher Sherwood, also from Gordon First Nation. Yeah, you can see we kind of like source each other quite a bit, so Chris is also from Gordon's. We've talked lots, and we actually met through the Facebook group. Now, one of the components of this is, of course, is the mapping. The other portion of this is the residential school. We're also doing genealogy. So there's many different components that we're adding into this. Those are the three main components right now that we're kind of focusing on. The fourth component that we're focusing on is photos. We'll be looking at creating a database for the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, as well as our veterans. Now, each First Nation I know has a lot of respect to our veterans that had served in our countries. So we want to make sure that our warriors are honored that way as well as influential people. You know, when I'm talking about influential people on our reserve, we want to make sure that we're, collecting data from all of our chiefs in order to pass on that knowledge to some of our younger members. And we call those members, which is, our community members. It's also going to be a way to teach, to connect with our younger generation. So one of the great things about being First Nation is that you have no choice but to be adaptable to change. And, my background, I've actually worked 15 years in communications. I've never had to teach a First Nations person how to use a cell phone. I've only had to teach, farmers from the rural areas, that were a little resistant to change. And I'm from Saskatchewan, so we're quite full of farmers. So as we're looking into some of this stuff, a couple of the things I definitely want to get into here is I want to show you a little bit how the school looks. So, as I'm talking about, that's the next slide. Sorry, I got ahead of myself there. But as we're talking about the Mushroom system, Chris would wring my neck if I did not bring up some of the security requirements that we talk about. So the security on the Mushroom system needs to meet all standard at online activity, including the TLS level, and then blah, blah, blah. I'm not kind of the security person, but I do want to make sure that you guys see that we are taking this seriously, especially when we are looking at these security requirements. Because one of the reasons as we were looking into different programs, Chris and I, was that if we were using a program that was open source, it would be so vulnerable to attacks. And we didn't want to have a system that was open to that, especially if we wanted to share and replicate the system to different First Nations. We wanted the system to be as secure as possible. This is one of the biggest things, in terms of what we can offer about the project, is that the security requirements are going to be great. And top notch. There's, everything's going to be two-factored. Where one of the security requirements that we're definitely having within this is security of who can see what levels of data. So if you are looking—
I hate to interrupt, but we were slotted for an hour and a half. I had slotted us for a 90-minute presentation, but apparently we only have an hour.
Oh, sorry.
So we only have 12 minutes left.
No worries.
So we're gonna have to, I don't know, just make it quick, I guess.
Hey, no worries.
No time for questions. We're just gonna allow Janna to just continue, because I know you also want to get into the virtual reality work.
Right. So, one of the things about the Mushroom project is, I'm pretty much in data collection phase right now. I'm collecting as much data that I possibly can. As we're building this archive, we're also really specific with the type of data points that we have. So as I mentioned, the data points that we're collecting are very specific in terms of, we're seeing it through an Indigenous lens. And as well as it's a tool to find, information, because in the end, what we want to do is create algorithms to find out some of those missing data points, especially when we have a different number of nations all over Canada and the US connected. We can kind of see trends and hopefully see things that, regular, you know, government, law enforcement, things like that can't see, as well as inspire other projects. So, as I'm doing this, I'm also thinking about once I get this up and going, I want to start focusing on some of our virtual reality experiences, especially on First Nations, right? And I can't do that without having the data there for me to draw upon. So I want to be able to share, how it felt like when you were in residential school, how it felt like going up the stairs, and especially if you're seeing it from a child's perspective, the institutionalized version of just not being at home. So that's a huge way that we can start sharing it and gaining a lot of, the reason I say this is because a lot of our members, like Christine, have moved away, and I want to make sure that everybody has access to this when you're a member, even if you can't get back to Gordon's. We have to take into consideration that things like COVID are going to happen, maybe not soon, but, that to give people easier access, because we've learned a lot about technology in the past year and a half. And
something you've said to me before about the virtual reality project that's always really resonated with me was how a lot of people, like for instance, the George Gordon school has been taken down,
right,
and then the school that you're focusing on is which nation is that again?
Here's the next one over, which is Muskowekwan. And
yeah,
it's still standing. So I want to definitely see the way the schools, because we need to preserve it. Because at the time that Gordon's was torn down, and actually we're sitting here, it's been 25 years since the Gordon School was torn down. We've got one remaining intact residential school in Saskatchewan, and that's in the next reserve over. I would say about 20 miles, because I'm sorry, you guys are American, I'm trying my best here, 20 miles over, and it's still standing. So, the hope for that building is to turn it into a museum and a place to store stuff, as well as, in my case, I want to make sure that we're recording it and we want to share it with everybody, because, that way we can get everybody on Turtle Island to say, hey, this existed. And, if Muskowekwan is torn down, then everything in Saskatchewan has been erased when it comes to residential schools, and that can't happen. That goes along with, and nothing can be whitewashed. And if it is going to be whitewashed, once that school is torn down, it's going to erase a lot of what residential school was, because it just does not exist.
So in some ways, though it's a sore, it's like a cancer, in and of itself, it needs to be there as a reminder.
Yes.
That these did exist, so that we don't get, further erased in a way, and providing that virtual reality experience will allow people to connect from all over the world, essentially, right? Absolutely. Is that the idea? Okay.
Yeah. Even when we're looking at just our own population of Gordons, we've got members that are in Switzerland and Spain, all over Turtle Island. So, we need to make sure that, I'm looking at it specifically targeting them, but it opens up so much more, because we're not the only ones that are, we had the pass system. I don't know if you know what the pass system is. It basically meant that we couldn't leave the reserve without a pass. So, kind of what everybody did was make babies, and they just, spread out all over the world. So, especially with the 60 scoop and that kind of stuff. So 60 scoops was when they took babies from the First Nation and adopted them out to white couples. I've had cousins that were adopted out in Alabama, California. So it allows them to be able to start to reconnect with the culture. without physically coming to the reserve, even though I know that's the goal of everybody that has ever left or has ever known that their connection is with Gordons.
And the idea that you and I have been talking about briefly is maybe having this extend to other schools around Turtle Island.
Absolutely.
So I know there's a school here in Nebraska that, because we do a lot of work in Iowa and Nebraska, where we would like to see a virtual reality project move forward. So if you get the Mushroom project, which allows for the data collection, and then the virtual reality project off the ground, then this could be implemented in other places as well. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I just want to quickly show you guys the Mushroom project here, just how our website design is. Now, this is just a prototype. We are slowly getting there, and I want to just kind of give you something tangible to see.
While she's looking for that, we only have about 5 minutes left, but I just want to say that, like, the reason that, like I said earlier, we're having this conversation is because Janna is one of few people, throughout Turtle Island that is taking this real proactive approach to understanding, documenting, and providing cutting edge resources to allowing the world to really understand this situation. It's really important that it come from Indigenous people and that we support Indigenous people in this work. And also George Gordon First Nations school was the longest running school in Canadian history. So there's a lot going on there.
So there's a lot. So let me just show you. This is our way that we're tracking. This is the first version of the GGFN and in area archive. As you can see, I've got the admin view. This is our residential school section. We've got two different sections that we're working on right now, which is just a residential individual form. And now this, as we're looking at this, just remember, this is just one school. If we can set up Muskowakin, as well as anybody in Treaty 4, we're looking at 5 different schools, because more than likely one student didn't just go to one school, they went to a couple different schools. For instance, in Gordon's, when the school burnt in 1929, they were shipped to the Elkhorn School in Manitoba. So we need to be able to start tracking where children went to. Now, the other thing we wanted to do is start tracking some of the staff members, just to make sure that, it's just important that we do. A lot of our people are looking to us in terms of validating some of their claims when it comes to day school, which is another thing that we're going through here in Canada, as well as residential school claims. Just so that we have that information available to our members. As I said, we did initially focus on genealogy but we kind of, put that on one of the back burners because residential schools has become such a hot topic. So we do have our genealogy administration tools with family name as well as individuals. Now, when I talk about family names, we're coming from a population that started approximately 146 people that were all related. So you can track it to all the original members through their family names, and they do spread. It does spread out. So these are some of the core family names that are from Gordon's. If you can see, we got quite a bit of, Anglo-French sounding names. We weren't as lucky as Treaty 7 with the straight up, the straight up trend. Like, for instance,
a lot of people kept their traditional names.
Right.
Treaty
Whereas we took on new names.
Mm-hmm.
So that also makes it hard to trace genealogy. so
Well, we have a minute left. Is there anything you want to say to the audience before we end our presentation?
yes, absolutely. Some of the ways that you can help out is, definitely, taking a look and giving us a contact if you have any further information. We are looking for, grants and donations to help us get going. This isn't a project that we expect to make a whole lot of money on. We just need to get some of the basics of this covered. And as somebody did mention about Janna's law, I am very persevere. I have a lot of perseverance. Like, I need to get this finished. So if I can change law, I can pretty much do anything.
My cousin is a dynamo. She changed law in Saskatchewan, and there's a law named after her.
So, just to kind of show that I need to get this done. This is one of the biggest issues we have, especially in First Nation country, or Indian country, as we'd like to call it. And we want to make sure that these children are honored, and, all children matter, and that we love them and we will never forget them.
Thank you. Ahai kitata mahin to everybody for listening to us today. If you do have questions, please feel free to message myself or Janna. And I will put our, Janna, if you want to put your email in the chat, I'll put my email in the chat. And I'm sorry we don't have time to answer questions, but please email if you want to know more. Thank you.
Me go ahead.
Thank you both very, very much.